This is part 3 of the Craftsman Atlas Head and Table Lift Rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 2, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we will be assembling and installing the head and table lift. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. First, we're going to be assembling the hand crank gear assembly. And this gear actually can come off of that shaft, but the shaft is splined, so I never took it off of there because I didn't want to have any issues with it going back on. And it had one small taper pin in there, and I'm going to reinstall that single taper pin with a brass punch and a brass hammer. And then I'm going to install another taper pin on the other side. The hole for the taper pin is all the way through. And it made getting that taper pin out initially real easy. But I really feel like it should have had a full taper pin or two small ones. So we're just going to throw this taper pin in the other side. And if I ever have to take it off for whatever reason, well, I'll deal with it at that point. But this way, it's completely fixed to that shaft. Next, we're going to lube up the machine surfaces of the gearbox cover with this multi-purpose lithium grease. And we're just going to use a little bit. We're not slapping it on there. And then the back side of the gear where you see me adding it. We're not really going to get a whole lot on the shaft because there's an oil port and we'll be using oil for that. But where this metal on metal contact is, I want to make sure that there's at least some grease on it. And the same for the outside machine surface. So then we can insert the gear and shaft. And then this is the locking collar. And we're just going to lube the side of the locking collar that interfaces with that machined surface. And then slide it on there. Then we'll insert the slotted set screw into that locking collar. And then we'll just hold everything nice and tight, compressing it all, and tighten down that set screw. And you can see that oil port right below the set screw right now. And we'll be just adding some machine oil into that port later on. Make sure that everything moves nice and smooth. So then we need to attach the hand crank to the shaft. We're just lining up those holes that the longer taper pin goes through. And obviously one side of the holes are a little bit tighter than the other, so we're installing it through the widest opening first. And I'm just going to use this block of wood. I'm trying to see which way to rotate that cover so that it keeps the handle pretty level. And we're just going to use the hammer, the brass hammer, and get it started, and then we'll seat it with that brass punch. And there we go. Yeah, maybe one or two more smacks. Good enough. And everything works like it should. And here we are with the gearbox, and we're going to do kind of the same thing. We're going to lube up all the machine surfaces with that lithium grease. We're not getting a whole lot of grease inside the bore. In fact, if we get no grease in the bore, that's better. But like I said, well, at least that lower bore has an oil port. The upper bore, which I've got it inverted right now, does not have an oil port. So we're going to be lubing that shaft part of the threaded rod that goes through that upper bore with the lithium grease. So we're now just lubing up the back side of the gear where it interfaces with the machine surface. And then we can install the gear. And then we have the threaded rod. So we'll lube up the keyway and a little bit of the shaft where it's going to interface with the inside of the gear itself. And then we're going to lube up the whole top section. And that's because it's going to ride in that top bore, and like I said, there's no oil port for that top bore, so the only lube is going to be this grease. Then we can go ahead and insert the threaded rod. All we got to do is line up that keyway with the key in the gear. And then kind of push it up through the gear until it seats itself. And there we go. Then we've got the thrust bearing, and then the washer, and then there are two nuts, and they basically jam against each other to keep from spinning off. So we're just going to hand tighten them for right now. Worry about tightening them down a little bit later. And we're going to rotate the assembly and install the locking collar. So the whole purpose of this locking collar is to lock the gear to the gearbox. So we're just going to lube the side of it that interfaces with the milled surface of the gearbox. And then slide it down on the threaded rod. And then install the slotted set screw. So I'm going to compress the locking ring with my thumb and then tighten it down. Like so. Just make sure all that's working. All right, next we're going to go ahead and lube up the gears. And again, we're going to be using that lithium grease. This is not moving at a high rate of speed or anything like that. There's not a heat issue, so just about any kind of grease would work. This is just what I had in addition to the other greases I had, so that's why I'm using it. And we're just putting copious amounts on the gears themselves. After we've got the gear and the gearbox lubed, then we'll go ahead and lube the gear on the hand crank. Then we're going to go ahead and lube up that machined surface on the cover and then the machined surface that's on the gearbox itself. And this will seal up that area. Now I'm going to put a little bit of lube in each one of those threaded holes there that the locking screws go in. That'll just help with keeping them from rusting. And then we can mate the gears. And then insert the locking screws. Then we're going to tighten down those locking screws. And then clean off any of that excess grease around the edge. And here I've used a little bit of Loctite and jammed those two nuts against each other. And I made sure that it's not too tight that I can't crank the crank, if that made any sense. So next we need to go ahead and assemble the locks for the lower collar or locking collar. So this is the lock handle. And this is the sleeve. And we'll do the same thing with the nut, and we'll also lube the inside bores, the column bores. And I'm using super lube for all of this, just like I would on a drill press. Paper towel number 300. And then install that nut, which I probably should have waited because it's going to fall out in a little bit here, but basically you can see on the table all the parts for my drill press. So I've installed a column collar on there. Everything else is off of the shaft. There goes that nut. And yes, I'm wearing flip-flops in the shop today. Wear combat boots for 24 years. You wear flip-flops whenever you can. Anyways, get that lock working. And then we'll rotate it so that the threaded bore is facing away from us, like so. So now we'll install the actual drill press table. And then I'm lubing up with super lube the lock, sleeve, nut, and handle screw for the gearbox. We slide the gearbox on there, and magically that gearbox is staying right where it is. Actually, it's got that long threaded rod on the opposite side where we can't see it, that's resting on the lower collar. So then we can put the locks in. And lock it down. And then we just need to readjust where all this is located on the column so that we have enough room for the head to be installed on the column. And then once we got everything where it needs to be, we'll start that threaded rod in the lower collar, and then we're going to tighten down that gearbox. And then we can test it. So you can see the table is lifting here. Don't worry, I'm going to move the camera in a minute so that you can see this side of it. So now we need to just lube. And this is just machine oil. And so I'm lubing up that lube port that is in the gearbox cover, and then the lube port that's on the bottom of the gearbox itself. And then I'm going to lube up where the rod is interfacing with the lower collar, and put a little bit of lube on the threaded rod itself. And then we can just crank that sucker up. And I'm going to crank it all the way up and then all the way back down. But here you can see it's working perfectly. So after we've reinstalled all the other parts for the drill press, we make sure the drill press is operating properly. And then this is the finished project. My 100 series drill press with the Craftsman Atlas head and table lift and a float lock drill press vise. And Jay Ziggy's slow speed pulley up top. Man, I love how this thing looks, and it turned out great. And that is going to wrap up this video series. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. The next project is that drill press all the way in the right-hand corner over there. It's another 100. We'll be tearing into that soon. And until then, I will see you next time.